So I'm delighted to be here with you. And to just build on Steve's comment, I'm actually the executive president of executive education at IE Business School. So I'm coming to you today in quality of a business leader of that unit. We are indeed an academic institution, but I'm not the professor. I'm not the teaching and learning expert. I'm actually leading a business that is looking and striving to serve many of you in this room in the best way possible in a changing world. So today, and actually before I get into the topic, there are sort of two things that I want to share with you about my background so that you know the full context of where I'm coming from. I have had the privilege to work for over 20 years at a leading management consulting firm. I was one of the leaders of the private equity practice, spent over a decade really trying to think long and hard how to help investors make better investment decisions, especially in the private equity practice. So really thinking about how you evaluate business, how do you come to terms with what the real value is, how do you come to terms with how much value can you add, and therefore what might be a reasonable return of that. And I was a service provider to those investors. I was a component of the final decision. And as such, I find there's a lot of similarities between what I have spent a long time doing with what I am doing now, recognizing we at IE Executive Education are a part of a broader equation that's pretty complex and hard to solve. I also, as a member of that organization, had the luxury of being trained, mentored, coached in a very special way. And actually, it was the reason that, in my personal case, kept me in that organization for close to 20 years. My other background, which I think is relevant to this discussion, is that I moved from this management consulting firm to leading one of the educational publishers with global responsibilities for strategy and business development. And as such, I had the challenge to help a company decide and define the direction of how to become a digital, how to lead actually a digital transformation, move from textbooks to different solutions with greater value add, and along the way, bring the organization. In that capacity, I had the benefit to hire a leading business school to help train 50 or 70 of our highest potential executives into that journey. So I consider learning as a key part of driving that change, and I have a pretty good flavor of what it is like to actually work with academic institutions in partnering in that journey. So that is my background. And what I hope I leave you with today is 3 simple ideas. Number one is we're all talking about how context is changing, technology, VUCA. I want to maybe start, developing a hypothesis with all of you that possibly we're changing a new era of the firm with different rules of the game. And spending a little bit of time understanding those might actually help us think about how we can contribute and add value as HR functions or as providers to the ecosystem to that firm. The second idea that I want to leave you with is, while we're all professionals in learning, learning is a piece of the equation. And I would argue, and like to put forward a second hypothesis, that it is more about adapting than learning. Learning is a part of it. And third, it is, I think, a world where we're becoming more open, where it is more important to understand the ecosystem and how to influence the ecosystem than to own and command the ecosystem. So the idea that has been discussed at length today about how do you put learners in the driver's seat and what are the implications for all of us is actually critical to success. So the third idea is really how do we think about helping them to bring your own learning. So those are the three ideas. And I'll start with, I know it's the time before lunch. So let me ask a question, which I will help provide an answer to at the middle of the presentation. What do you think a giraffe has to do with learning in time of globalizations? And I'm not expecting the answer yet. Just something for you, some food for thought. Let's see if I can get to, I can get you all to give an answer to this. But so, times of globalization. I like to, put some of the specifics to some of the things that have been discussed. So, technological change is paramount. Here's some specific data around how speed has changed. 75 years for phones to reach 50 million users in the US, only 35 days to reach 50 million users. No question, speed matters. And speed is actually one of the early indicators that we may be changing the era. And I'll elaborate in a minute. We've heard VUCA, but VUCA, again, not a theoretical concept. Just in the past 6 months, 7 now, those two things were unthinkable. And imagine what that means for the executive who is living on exports to the US and is based in Mexico. Imagine what that means for the company depending on UK and what that, the changing growth expectations is doing to their business. So very, very tangible, very real, very much a today issue. And in that context, we've heard some of this as well. The pressure of results doesn't go away. This is the average life cycle of the S&P 500 companies and how it has evolved over the last few decades, with the expectation that, in the turn of the next decade, we're talking about, around 10 to 12 years. And you all know that this is not only happening to companies. It is reality for executives as well. The average tenure of executives, whether CEOs, C-suite, middle management, is only going in one direction, which is shorter and shorter. The pressure for results, it's very real. And speed in delivering those is paramount to survival. And so, is it possible that we're actually facing a change of era in the firm? And what does that mean, and why is this question relevant? So, what it means is that the way a firm is guided is actually changing. And this happens, in the history of times every 40, 50 years. It is really hard to define the end of an era and the beginning of another one. It's a blurry border, and you kind of only know when that happened with hindsight. But I would hypothesize that we might be actually reaching that border. And what are the early indicators that this is happening? Technology. Of course, as I said, faster, but fundamentally changing the paradigm. When I was at business school, we used to be taught about, you can either be a scale player or you can be a niche player delivering customer intimacy. today technology allows for scale and delivering to a segment of one. Personalization and customization is possible at a low cost. So we were familiar with how to measure economies of scale. I'm not sure we are quite there yet on how to measure economies of speed. And as we all know, we've got to be careful with what we measure because it actually does drive to a large extent behavior, and it does drive to a large extent success or failure. So speed, so technology is a key enabler of this new era. But there are more. Second one is challenging microenvironment context. Governments are becoming much more activist. The talks around inequality are very much forefront. The political parties defending the fight against that inequality are actually not dissimilar. I mean, they're not minority political parties. Corporations and being part of that dialogue, purpose is an increasing part of how they frame their success and a non-negotiable part of their success and their narrative. So that's becoming more and more prevalent. We've talked at length about the new workforce, so I won't elaborate much more. 6 generations at work, very different expectations on what the function of work in their lives there is and how they actually work and collaborate with their bosses and their peers. The fourth indicator that this may be a new era for the firm is that firms are becoming more and more complex. So we went from pretty standard organizations to matrix organizations. We've actually evolved to 3D organizations. And who today, and the panel right before was a good illustration of that. So it is about reporting to a business unit, reporting to a geography, reporting to a functional head. And of course, increasingly, all of us have an increasing time spent on special projects that cut across the organization in new ways that are not even three-dimensional. So the firm is becoming way more complex. And by the way, in this environment, it is much less about the assets you own. It is a lot more about the ecosystems you play in and the ecosystems you control. So thinking differently about that firm is important. Last but not least, it used to be about capital. Capital is hugely available and is actually redefining the return expectations and the time horizon. Back in the late 1990s, it was 4 years till you IPO'd a company. So time to liquidity was relatively short. In this decade, actually 15 years since the 2000s, it is 11 years from the time, the median, from the time you actually invest in a company to the time you actually can get liquidity. So capital is being redefined. Not only is it available, it is actually looking at different ways to participate in the firm. So if this hypothesis bears true, and we're starting a new era of the firm, how do we think about the leaders and the talent that this firm is needing? And as I said, again, if we put a name to all of this complexity and change, maybe we can start addressing it and putting some focus on what matters. And so one of the hypotheses here is that we've all talked about the need for agile talent, faster learners, learning-led, our learning and development functions. How do we think about what really matters? And I'm going to give you two quotes just to prompt the debate. One of what it is today, the leading company in market value, and another one from a talent expert, just to give you a sense of what they're thinking about. Nothing new to any of you, but I just think it's interesting who they're coming from. So, new kind of leader who can actually adapt on the fly. Google, it is first and foremost about cognitive abilities. Nothing new. But I like to just kind of put in context, the second point of my intervention today is really about what really matters is not necessarily learning, but it is the ability to adapt. And it is true for individuals, but it is also true for organizations. There's some Dutch in the room. I don't know if you recognize him, the master behind scenario planning. It is about how organizations actually develop an ability to learn faster and adapt faster. So I like to talk to you about the concept of AQ. So we've heard about IQ, we've heard about EQ, and I think we need to start talking about AQ, adaptive coefficient, as a key element, a key trait for our leaders and our organizations. And how do we bring that down to all employees in the organization? And I'm not going to work and talk about employees, because increasingly all of you will have to work with collaborators, broadly speaking. Some of them will be part of the firm, some of them will be part of the ecosystem. And I think we all here are members of that ecosystem, and we need to learn how to work together. So how do we think about managing this AQ? In my mind, there are three components that are important to understand. Cognitive ability, no surprises to many of you. I'm sure some of the providers here have developed the software that actually can really measure the ability to focus, the ability to process information, the ability to use your short and long-term memory, the ability to sequence, the ability to, anyway, and so on and so forth. So cognitive ability as a key component of what we need to work on, and of course understand how to improve, and by that measure it. Let me move to the third point. EQ, emotional traits, still matters. Very glad that that the World Economic Forum finally decided to make it one of the top 20 skills that we need to work on. So, emotional traits matter, but I would take this beyond empathy and sympathy. It does have to do with, I think, other very important dimensions, such as risk-taking, such as perseverance, such as ability to take feedback, ability to develop curiosity. So really, again, a number of elements that are, I think, with the focus on EQ over the last 2 decades, some real good progress in working on this dimension. I want to pause and talk about the second dimension. It's that mindset concept. Today, so I think We know that millennials are here. We know that there's 6 generations together at work. We know that in Europe, at least half of the population in general, I don't have the data for the workforce, is over 50. How do we get these individuals to want to learn? And let me go back to trying to understand our user. So that executive or that manager still only has 24 hours a day. He's being told over and over again that he needs to work out and well-being matters and sleep matters. So there's only so many hours he or she can dedicate to work. And yes, in addition to, learning, they need to deliver. They need to continue pushing their organizations to the forefront of customer service, product innovation, or whatever it is. And while in the panel before that was providing a really interesting perspective, sort of dedicating time to learning is not against productivity. We frankly, we buy that, and I think it's a good case to make, and it's an important one. But if we go back to the user, the pressure is huge. And the rationale behind, I need to take time off to learn, and by the way, I need to continue doing that nonstop. And some of the questions that were posed yesterday, what if in 12 months or 18 months you had to change jobs? What would you, where would you go? How are you constantly in the, upgrading your skills mode and still are happy with it and can bring your best to work? It's not easy. And so, there's many theories around how we can do that, but I think from a business perspective and from a leadership perspective and from an ecosystem perspective, I think one of the things we need to acknowledge is that without that mindset, that learning mindset, the adaptive coefficient is hard to, it's hard to be improved. And so really peeling the onion and understanding how we actually get that learning mindset is important. And how do we, for those 50 years old who actually are afraid of the digital economy and the new technology, how do we help them be comfortable with asking the right questions and dedicating and investing time to understanding and learning what the digital or the technology, broadly speaking, can do for them, for their job, for their organizations. So addressing that fear factor is important. And the thinking behind, behind the growth mindset and how there is a possibility to, keep learning despite your age, and what matters is the process and starting the process is very important to that. And so that's one point. Once they've overcome the fear, it is really critical to spark the curiosity. And spark the curiosity is, again, an enabler to getting those individuals, whether the millennials or baby boomers, to actually put in the time it takes to learn. And so being clear around methodologies and mediums to allow that curiosity to start and actually sort of make them understand what's in it for them is important. And of course, this has to happen in a multimodal way. It has to happen, learning does happen everywhere. But let's not forget, and I remember spending quite a bit of time on that with our learning scientists in my previous career, in my previous job, is, we can all try to make learning more engaging. We can all try to make it more fun and gamified. We recognize the importance of micro-learning, but at the end of the day, it is actually an important effort. It does require practice. It does require deliberate practice. It does require expert advice. And there's very little way out of that one. And so this learning mindset and those emotional traits are very, very important to actually embed in the organization to keep fostering that adaptive coefficient. So the second idea, as I sort of wrap this up, is really, it is learning matters, development matters as a part of delivering greater ability to adapt because of the things I highlighted in the first part. So why did I put a giraffe, and what does a giraffe have to do with learning in times of globalization? Any thoughts? I know we're getting close to lunch. It is, do you want to? It is, I think it is the idea, and spot on, how do we build individuals that are fit for purpose in this new era? And really thinking about the ability to adapt as a key to survival in this new era. And so that's indeed the reason. So it was my maybe simplistic analogy to make a point that and how that AQ really, really matters. So if we're actually in an environment where firms are going to behave differently, if it is about having individuals and organizations developing an ability to adapt in a never faster environment, what's the best way to do that? And I think it's interesting to talk about whether L&D should fit into HR or in the business. But I think it's even more important to comprehend and understand, some of what our speaker earlier this morning talked about. Learning happens everywhere. There is knowledge everywhere. And individuals are bound to, pick and choose. And as a matter of fact, a company that was mentioned this morning that I really like, Degreed, just came up with a report where actually they state that learners in large organizations spend more time learning by their own, by themselves than learning in their traditional L&D sources. So this is the new normal. And if this is the new normal, how do people in this ecosystem embrace it, and what do we do about it? And I like to share the analogy of what happened with the world of bring your own device. I don't know if you remember that, but anyway, there was a time where 95% of the employees actually use a personal device at work. 2 years ago, there was a forecast that by this year, half of the employers would actually ask employees to bring their own device. And some of the early benefits of bringing your own device have actually proven that there is an increase in productivity. People have a better morale because they can do and operate the way they like to operate. I like a Mac, I like a PC, and both work. There is just generally a positive effect. But the counter to that is people and companies failing to see that trend really struggled. And so, and so this is just a quick snapshot of what happened to BlackBerry from the time where the iPhone came out, better, simpler device, where there was someone enabling the open ecosystem with Intel, allowing for that to be a wider reality. And when most companies were in a situation where bring your own device was actually a possibility. So is there some analogies for this to our sector? Bring your own learning. Previous to the year 2000, just 15 to 16% of the workforce had been less than 2 years in their current workplace. Post-2000, that number is 51%. How do you invest institutionally and days of training into those individuals when they're going to move and their average tenure is only going in one direction? How do we rethink that? How do we leverage the fact that today 15%, this is a global number, of the workforce is actually freelancers and contractors. That number in the US today is more like this one, 30 plus. And globally, the trend is clearly going towards the gig economy. How do we think about that ecosystem so that we don't become BlackBerry? So bring your own learning and put the learner in the driver's seat is something that you've all talked about. I think what this hopefully does for you is that I think this is going to be, this is today the new normal. And what we ought to be thinking about is how do we then empower and help that workforce to better use the bring your own learning. So what are the imperatives if you today can learn certainly at universities, certainly at corporate universities, certainly in MOOCs and Udemy's and marketplaces of knowledge, of course in fairs like this one, books, articles, you name it. So what are the imperatives for many of us? One is, thinking about learning more broadly. It is about adapting, and it is not only about a set of knowledge, not only about a set of skills, it is about what puts it together and keeps it alive in the life of a professional. It is about empowering the workforce and let them take control of something that is vital to their success and their survival. 3, it's just fascinating how many industrial companies, many consumer companies are actually becoming technology companies. So if you become an open company, it is about what APIs work for you. How do you integrate with the ecosystem? How do you develop developers to find solutions that work in your ecosystem? So the focus becomes on that integration and less so on what is the content. And of course, for that to happen, you need to be able to develop the ability to curate what is good learning versus bad learning. And that is, I think, a fundamental shift in the focus for the L&D function. And of course, reward and celebrate. The incentives are hard. The culture is hard to move. And I'm a big proponent that one of the best ways to change cultures is actually through celebration and showcasing the learner that made his or her way through, with their own learning and really getting success for the firm, whether it is in launch of new initiatives, whether it is in better serving their customers, and so on and so forth. So with that, I know I've been blinking for a minute or two. With that, I'd like to leave you with the thought of really empowering your workforce to bring your own learning, to work on making all of us more adaptive, and hopefully, and really looking forward to playing better together in this ecosystem that we all play a very important part in. Thank you.